turn your phones off if they're on, and watch that step. As always, this is the third lesson on church history we're going through. Actually, 4 weeks ago we did one on Jewish history, and that was kind of up the second time period in preparation for church history. The first church history series was on the early church, from Jesus' time up to roughly 350 AD, the first 300 years of the church. We went up to 1350 on the first week. So from the beginning up to 1350. 1350, up to the pre-Reformation. Now last week was the pre-Reformation and the Reformation. This week is kind of zeroing in on the Anabaptist movement from the last 500 years. I guess it's this coming week. I mean, what day is it? 21st, which is Friday, right? Tuesday. Tuesday is the 500th year anniversary of kind of the beginning of the Anabaptist movement in Switzerland. So that's what this is kind of focused around. The next 3 weeks will be kind of the essential elements of Anabaptism. We're going to talk about some of those today as well. But the first one's going to be on the idea of discipleship. The second one is the idea of the pure church. And the third one is the two kingdom concept. And I'll let them go into those. Matt and Dawson go into those, and I won't do this morning. So when you're looking at church history, the question that always comes back is, what is real Christianity? And church history is every generation trying to figure out what is real Christianity. Because there will always be imposters. There will always be people that are claiming to be Christians who are not living the same way as other Christians. And so what is real Christianity? And for the last 2,000 years, every generation had to figure that out for themselves. What is real Christianity? Now, how many generations were in the last 2,000 years? A lot. Depends how long you make a generation. But if you just say it's 20 years, that's a lot of generations. A lot of people had to wrestle with this question: is what is true Christianity? In the last 500 years, lots of people had to wrestle with that question as well. During our sharing time, whoever leads out with that, who's leading out? You figure that out, Dawson? That might be a good thing to spend some time on. What is real Christianity in our context? How are we going to define real Christianity? So last week, a little bit of review. Talked about Anabaptist beginning, and they were in this time of political turmoil. You had the progressive peasant rebellions. They're going to make a perfect world. You had the mystics, who is going to live in a perfect state of mind. You have the traditionalists, the Catholics, who want to just keep everything going the way it was. And then you had the fundamentalists, the reformers, who wanted to focus on the ideal truth, anchor themselves in the very truth, and we've got it. And in the middle of that, the Anabaptists pop up and they say, there's got to be something more than all these four things that are pulling at us, tugging at us. And I think they would have answered the question is, what is Christianity like this? The essence of man is found in the creation of God's image. The essence of a Christian is found in his rebirth in the image of Christ. Christianity is not about idealism, not about personal revelations, theology, or culture. To make any of these the essence of Christianity is idolatry. Christianity is Christocentric, Christ-centered, regenerative discipleship. That's how they have answered that. And sometimes those Anabaptists got pulled in one of these other ways a little bit. Sometimes people who were claiming to be Anabaptists were really fit much better in one of these other groups. The mystics, on the bottom there, I have the cages that were hung on the church steeple are still there. Church steeple in Munster. Yes, they were rebaptized, but all the other elements of who they were was very Lutheran. So who are they? Well, they're a mixture. They're trying to borrow from here and there and everywhere and forming their own worldview. Menno Simons answered this question of what is true Christianity with true evangelical faith is of such a nature it cannot lie dormant, but spreads itself out in all kinds of righteousness and fruits of love. It dies to flesh and blood. It destroys all lust and forbidden desires. It seeks, serves, and fears God in its inmost soul. It clothes the naked. It feeds the hungry. It comforts the sorrowful. It shelters the destitute. It aids and consoles the sad. It does good to those who do it harm. It serves those who harm it. It prays for those who persecute it. It teaches, admonishes, and judges us with the word of the Lord. It seeks those who are lost. It binds up the wounded. It heals the sick. It saves what is sound. It becomes all things to all people. The persecution, suffering, and anguish They came to it for the sake of the Lord's truth, have become a glorious joy and comfort to it. That's how he answered the question is, what is true Christianity? And we would have to answer that question too. If you do not answer the question of what is true Christianity, and actually spend some time thinking about it, you will pick an answer. And it might not be the answer you want to pick. As you think back on it years later, you might say, I picked the wrong answer. But everybody will answer that question either through their life or through their thinking or through some other way of what is true Christianity. The Swiss Anabaptists, again, review from last week, started January 21st, 1525, and it began with a baptism. And we talked about how they were mentored underneath Zwingli a little bit, and they were Bible studying together, and they wanted to take their faith in an area that Zwingli did not want to go. He wanted to just appeal to the princes, the local people, appeal to their power and their authority, and not get himself in trouble. And so he was not willing to go where they wanted to go. And they said, we're willing to die for this. And they did. They were baptized on 1525. 2 years later, they met together. The leaders of the movement met together for the Schleitheim Confession, 1527. They were heavily persecuted. They fled to Germany and throughout Europe. Part of the spread of Anabaptism was because they were fleeing persecution, and so they spread quickly. In less than about 30 years, there was as many Anabaptists as what there was in the first 150 years of Christianity. It spread much faster, and it's because of that severe persecution. They had missional teams. When they weren't fleeing persecution, if they had time to stop and think, they would get together missionary teams and send them out. And I mentioned they had a pastor, a preacher, they had a deacon, and they had an athlete, a runner. And the athlete was there in the shadows a little bit so that when he see the pastor and the deacon get killed, he could run back home and say, they killed him, send some more. And then he returned with them and do it all over again. Gave their lives over and over again. The lifespan of a pastor was less than 2 years. In some areas, it was less than 2 months. From the time that you were selected as pastor to you were dead. Very, very quickly. Schleitheim Confession. There was seven articles in the Schleitheim Confession. The first one was baptism. And I have the whole thing if you want to read it, but I'm just going to summarize a little bit. The main thrust there was, it's for believers only. It's not for infants, it's for believers. You first must repent and then be baptized. The second one can be called the ban or church discipline. When somebody stops following Christ in a daily way, what is the church supposed to do about it? The churches they would have been familiar with would say, no big deal. There's people in the church that are Christians and people in the church that are not Christians. The Anabaptists said, no. If there's somebody in there that's not following Christ, we will expel them. We will put them out of the gathering. We will put them under the ban. We will not fellowship with them in the same way as we were before. Breaking of bread, communion. They said it's for believers only. And they said it's not something that you inherently get your grace for the week through taking the bread and the cup. It is in remembrance of what Christ did and focusing on Christ. It's not about us. Separation from evil. He said, you're not supposed to join forces with those that are not in the church. You're not supposed to go into business with them. You're not supposed to marry with them. You're not supposed to have close connections with them. You're supposed to be different. You're supposed to be sold out for God, separate from the world. They're pastors. You don't become a pastor because of your position or your wealth or your dad or anything else. You're supposed to pick men that are a good report, and they're supposed to lead the church in a godly way. The sword. He said, agape love. Love that is willing to sacrifice yourself. Sacrificial love replaces the use of force. We lay down our swords, we pick up love, and we love our neighbors. And then the last one was the oath. We said we do not swear an oath, but rather we live in honesty. Now, some of those might seem to us like, why is this a big deal? But in their context, these were big deals. There were 2 areas that they could not come to agreement on, that they would like to, I think. The one was the role of the Holy Spirit. How does the Holy Spirit work in our lives? And the other one was eschatology, end times. How do we deal with that? If they could have come to agreement on those 2 issues, it would have made it a lot easier for many Anabaptist groups in the last 500 years. And today, Anabaptist groups still have not really come to an agreement on those 2 issues. So we'll leave those alone. Dutch Anabaptists. You had the Swiss Anabaptists up here, my bad. Swiss Anabaptists here, they were down in Switzerland, a little bit farther south. The Dutch Anabaptists were up in the Netherlands. Dutch Anabaptists were an interesting group. They were never persecuted like the Swiss Brethren. They spread among the middle class. The early on in the Swiss Brethren, it was the intellectuals, and then through the I'm going to say the working class. This was the middle class, or maybe even the upper middle class. It's not your aristocracy, but it is your doctors, your lawyers, your professionals is where it spread the most. At one point in time, 80% of the doctors in the Netherlands were Anabaptists. That tells you something about who these people were. They were more prone to mysticism. They got off track there a number of times. And one of the good things was they sponsored the escape of the Swiss Brethren. Without the Dutch Brethren, even with all their faults, because they had many faults, without them, the Swiss Brethren would have been virtually eliminated. And they would have been like many other groups throughout history that popped up and then were eliminated. But they did help the Swiss Brethren survive. The last martyrs of the early times, I'm going to call it the early times, the early Anabaptist movement, was Hans Landis in Zurich. He was an outspoken leader. He refused to leave. They wanted to banish him. He says, no, my church is here. I'm going to pastor my church. And he chose to stay. And he had a superb reputation among his church and among the other people in Zurich. And so when they killed him, Zurich, the people of Zurich said, never again. We're not going to kill good men like that. And they never killed any more people for their faith after that. They had enough bloodshed. He was such a man that nobody could justify killing him. And so they had enough. The last one in Bern, a few years earlier, Bern was another strong center of Anabaptists, lots of Anabaptist influence there, was Hans Haschbacher, I think is how Hastelbacher or something like that. That's English pronunciation, not German, because I can't speak German. We know most of what we know about him was about a 32 verse poem that a fellow prisoner wrote about him. There's a few other things that we can corroborate with him. Before he died, he told the magistrate, he said, there are going to be 3 signs at my death that will tell you that I'm a godly man. The first is that my head will fall into my hat and laugh. Second is the sun would turn bright red. And the third is the water coming out of the city well is going to turn red as well. Now, did that all happen? Well, every account that we have from multiple different sources said that all happened. And the people of Bern were so disturbed by this that, again, they said, we're never doing this again. We're fighting against God. We're never doing this again. That was the last of the martyrs of the early Anabaptists. I have a little note down in the bottom. Bukharan, in the last few years, killed 3 times Anabaptists between 2013 and 2015, as in the whole 15th or 16th century in Europe. Now, those numbers are a little questionable because we don't know how many died in the early years in Europe. I think my numbers that I work off of would probably say it's not 3 times, but it's probably more anyway. But Anabaptists are still dying for their faith in a very, very large number. Approximately half of the people who are in the traditional Anabaptist churches are in Africa right now. About half the Baptists are, about half the Lutheran are too. Every denomination has a few people in the West, and most of them are in Africa. And Mennonites are no different. And many of those people are dying for their faith. So persecution is something that's still very much part of our history. They were chased from town to town. Many times they would flee. When somebody would move into a town and start persecution up, they would flee to another town. The Palatinate migration happened from 1650 to 1670. At that point in time, the king of that area, or the earl of that area, had just been through a war, and his population had been decimated. And so he had previously persecuted Anabaptists, but now he turned to their help, and he said, welcome, come on in. You can come to my place, give you farmland, you can live here in peace. A couple things they could not do. The one is they could not proselytize. Could not talk about their faith to those that were non-believers. They could not meet in public. And they could not meet in more than 20 families at a gathering, and they had to pay a special tax. Anytime that Anabaptists moved to a place where they had these kinds of conditions, it usually did not end well for them. This area here, it didn't end so well either, but it was within a few years that protection was taken away. But by that point in time, the Anabaptists in the Netherlands had heard about these people and got most of them out. When persecution did come into this area, it was not killing them. It was lesser persecutions. They would confiscate their stuff and that kind of things. So yeah, it did not end well there, but it was a great stopgap. During that time, though, one of the things that happened is they learned if we keep our heads down, if we don't talk about our faith, we don't get killed. And this had happened prior to this, but this was kind of the capstone of this. And it started the Anabaptist movement into a movement that was very aggressive at sharing their faith to one that was willing to be quiet for the sake of peace. In the early Anabaptists, they would take the ladies, the mothers at home, on market day, they would chain them to their houses so they could not go to market. Because they went to market, they were going to tell others about their faith, and Anabaptism was going to spread. So at market day, the authorities would go around and chain all the Anabaptist women to their houses so they couldn't leave. But they were willing to sacrifice this fervency for the gospel for peace, and they become the quiet in the land. In some ways, you could say they were driven into the ground. They were so beat off. All their thinkers, all their passionate people were knocked off or killed, and the ones that were left behind were just kind of beaten to submission, and they were beaten to the ground. So what lessons did they learn? Learn to keep quiet. Don't talk about your faith. Keep quiet. Keep to yourselves. Don't interact with those around you. Train your children, but don't tell your neighbor. That's the lessons they learned. What they should have learned was to follow Christ is to take up your cross. Expect to die. Perseverance worketh patience, and to die is gain. So they should have learned, but they learned the wrong lesson. Again, they had to answer the question, what is true Christianity? And they answered in a way that did not work out well for them. Physically it did, they survived, but not for the movement. Okay, we're going to fast forward just a little bit here. At the end of Luther's life, he mourned the fact that his followers were more heathen, and it depends on translation, he would use different words there, but more godless, more heathen than many of the Catholics that were around them and that they had been before. Because they had bought into this idea that all you need to do is believe, mental assent, and you're good with God. And they did not turn it into a life. Fast forward a little bit, Philip Spanner, he wanted to fix this in Lutheranism, and so he said, no, a truly transformed heart will transform the life. And he started talking about living out your faith through spiritual rebirth, individual devotion, and piety. And the idea of becoming spiritual athletes was another term that he borrowed from earlier Christians, and that is laying down the weight that might stop you from following Christ and training to be a better Christian. It's not that they were going to win Christ's favor, but it's the idea of becoming an athlete, a spiritual athlete. And this movement grew. In a very short time, it overtook most of Lutheranism, and it moved into the rest of the Christian world. It moved into the Anglicans, it moved into the Catholic Church, it moved into the Anabaptist Church and many other groups. It spread very quickly. In about, I would say, 60 years or so, it had impacted pretty much all of Christianity in the Western world. So it was a movement that was ripe. People saw the need for it, and it quickly spread. One place it spread was to some people in Germany. The Church of the Brethren is how it's known today. And there's probably a Church of the Brethren around here. I didn't look, but I'm sure there are. They're everywhere. But any of the Brethren churches, most of the Brethren churches, kind of come from this movement here. It started off with Alexander Mack and 7 others. Some sources will name the 7 others. Other sources say we don't know who they were. But they gathered together for Bible study and prayer. And eventually they came into questioning about their baptism. They were baptized as infants, but they came under the idea from the Anabaptists, borrowed it from the Anabaptists, that no, we should have believers' baptism. And so Alexander Mack was their leader, but he said, I don't want this movement to be named after me. So he wanted to pull straws, who's going to baptize everybody. And then this gathering said, no, we'll baptize you and you baptize the rest of us. And so that's what they did, and they were all baptized there. And very quickly, this movement spread throughout that area. 1708, so they're almost 200 years after the start of Anabaptism, and they never suffered the persecution that the early Anabaptists did. By this point in time, the secular authorities and other churches had gotten tired of the bloodshed, and they weren't killing people anymore, much at all anymore. So So their way of thinking is different. And even Brethren churches today, their way of thinking is different that you'll see in most Anabaptist churches. They don't have this idea of we are being pursued, we're being persecuted. They don't carry that with them. And there's some other things that they think through differently as well. Mack led his church to the Netherlands, and then the Mennonites there helped them migrate to Penn's Woods, or Pennsylvania. And today, that's kind of the center of the Brethren movement is in Pennsylvania, but it has spread out throughout the United States and Africa, South America. It's not so much in Europe anymore. It's mostly left Europe. But that is one large gathering that is often associated with the Anabaptists, though they kind of came in a little later. Another group that will sometimes claim to be Anabaptists is your Baptists. This is a little earlier. 1607 is the beginning of the Baptist movement. John Smith is often considered the father of the Baptist movement, and he was an Englishman. He was from England, not Germany. He was over in England, and if you remember in England, they were never quite comfortable underneath the crown, and so they had this little bit of rebellious nature. The Anglican Church had started there roughly 100 years prior to this, and it was started because King Henry wanted to divorce his wife. The Pope said no, so he started his own church, made himself Pope. This was the setting that John Smith was in. He's reading all literature from Anglican sources as well as other sources, and eventually he moves his gathering to Holland. Now, some people say he went there and raised the gathering there. Some people talk about, I think the most I heard was 20 families that moved with him up to Holland, and they were thinking they might fellowship with the Anabaptists. The problem is they were firebrands. They were preaching on the streets in Britain, and when they get to Netherlands, they see these people who have been beaten into the ground, who have learned that if we keep our heads down, we don't get killed. And they said, you can't do this. And so there's questions of whether they wanted to join them or not. John Smith said, yes, we should join them. They got a lot to offer us, and we can keep these other things, and maybe we can influence them as well. Thomas Huey said, no, they are not what God wanted them to do. God wants us to spread the gospel and so on, and so they had this kind of tension. Eventually, Thomas Huey excommunicates John Smith, and as well as one or two other brothers who were with John Smith, and they went over and joined the Anabaptist movement. Now, did they ever officially join? That's a little bit questionable. John Smith did marry an Anabaptist lady at one point when his first wife died, I think, if I remember right. He did join. Thomas Huey steered the church towards more of a Reformed thinking, Reformed theology, and away from the Anabaptist beliefs. So they held on to believers' baptism. All Baptist churches today will hold on to believers' baptism, but many of the other things in the Schleifen Confession, they're not going to hold on to. They steered them away. But John Smith, the father of the Baptist movement, was very comfortable with the Anabaptists. I think if the Anabaptists would have been alive and well during that time period, they would have simply merged, and the Baptist and Anabaptist church would be one right now. But because they had been beaten into the dirt, they never did merge. I've been walking into a number of Baptist churches already, and I will often in their hallway someplace, they will have a tribute to their forefathers. And they will have Conrad Grebel, George Blavrock, Felix Mons. They will list all of our forefathers on their walls too. And it's interesting seeing us both claiming the same forefathers, though kind of in a different way. Okay, you've got persecution happening in Europe. And about that time, Catherine the Great of Russia is trying to reform her world. She's ruling a country that is very much in the dark ages, you could say. Not near as advanced as all of Europe. And so she invites the Anabaptists to come there. And she says, I will give you land. You can teach us how to farm. You can have your own farms. And many of them took her up on the deal. They moved into southern Ukraine. Actually, a lot of areas that are being fought over right now were once held by Anabaptist people. Like millions of acres worth. Like most of the battlefields today were once farmed by Anabaptist people. They turned Ukraine into the breadbasket of Europe. And that's still sometimes called the breadbasket of Europe because these Anabaptist people, they worked hard. They did not spend their nights drinking at the local pub. They went home to their families, and they were able to outperform all the other peasants around them. And they taught them how to farm and so on. They were given military exemption from military service. At some points it was a fine they had to pay, but they were given a military exemption. But again, they were forbidden to evangelize. And that has always been a problem when Mennonites take that offer. We will keep quiet if we are allowed to be here. They were asked to pay taxes. They became very rich. And at one point in time, at least 6% of the industrial output, the factories in Russia, was Anabaptist factories. They produced almost all the farming equipment for the whole of Russia at one point in time. And they had several million acres of land. That's a lot of land. A million acres. And it's questionable how many several million they had. But there's good possibility that their economic output was at least 20% of Russia's output. And this was like 40 to 70,000 people. So it was kind of remarkable. But the good times came to an end. In 1870, they lost their special status of military exemption. And about 45% of the 100,000 Mennonites at that point in time prepared to leave. Russian government saw that their most industrious workers were ready to leave and packing up, and they came and convinced most of them to stay. About 18,000 did leave, and they moved to Canada. The ones who stayed made a mistake. They should have not stayed because times got very difficult for the Anabaptists that stayed. The Bolshevik Revolution happened. They started confiscating the farms of these foreigners. They confiscated these wealthy farms and made life very difficult for the Anabaptists. In the 1920s, another second wave happened, and about 21,000 fled to Central and South America primarily. And then there was a third, maybe you could say a fourth wave of people that left Russia. Today there are still some Anabaptists in Russia, but very, very few. Almost all of them that survived are in the America someplace, Central, South, or South Central, or North America. They have a little different way of thinking through life. Their persecution happened in the last 150 years. And I know many of these people, and most of them will hold multiple different passports from different countries because they have the idea is someday persecution can come here and we're going to have to flee. And you always want to have a backup plan. If you have a U.S. passport, your backup plan is limited to a few countries right now because the U.S. passport is getting weaker and weaker around the world. A lot of countries won't take it without a visa. But if you have a passport from, say, Iceland, you can travel anywhere, almost anywhere, without a visa. And so they will hold multiple different passports so they can get out in time of trouble. Some of the Anabaptists came to the U.S. and Penn's Woods again, Pennsylvania, became a place of refuge for them. John Lessing arrived in 1683, and the men started settling in the Franconia and Lancaster area. Franconia is the area that Lucinda grew up in. Lancaster is the area that Beth grew up in. So kind of that eastern, southeastern Pennsylvania is where they started settling. It was difficult. They had to clear trees. And it was Penn's Wood for a reason. It was big, old-growth timber. And you had to clear these trees that were big in order to have farmland. And so it was hard work. But the benefit is they were granted absolute freedom. There was no requirement that they could not evangelize. There's no requirement that they had to pay a tax to get out of military service. It was absolute freedom, something they had never had before. Every other time when they moved someplace, there was always conditions. Now there's no conditions. So if you are in that time period, where are you going to move? If things are tough in Europe, and you feel you have to go somewhere, do you go to Penn's Woods or you go to Russia? Penn's Woods is difficult, hard work. Russia, there's a wealthy community there. It's already established, it's a wealthy community, or I should say towards, not right at the beginning, but Russia was a little later. But many people had this question, where are we going to move? Penn's Woods was isolated. When you moved there, you were never going to hear from your family again, most likely. Russia, you could letters back and forth. Lots of friends there. Your church group was very easy to work with every day. Penn's Woods was dangerous. There's Indians there. The red men might kill you. Russia, you're protected. Penn's Woods had a long, difficult journey to get there by ship. And sailing across the Atlantic at that time, roughly a 95% chance you're going to make it. That's kind of low today. Would you hop on a plane today if you had a 5% chance this plane's going to wreck? They came anyway. Russia, the journey was long, but it was relatively easy and relatively safe. And you could expect to go there and possibly even come back if you want to come back for a visit someday in the future. Penn's Woods, no, you're moving there saying goodbye, never to return. Penn's Woods, there's little information about the area. They knew all kinds of rumors, but not a lot of great information. And in Russia, there was lots of description of the area, and they had lots of information. But the biggest question was, are you willing to go someplace where you have absolute freedom, or are you willing to go someplace where you have conditions? And evangelism was the biggest question mark. Which would you choose? Well, many of them chose Russia, many of them chose Penn's Woods. And down the road, a couple hundred years, we can see which ones made the best choice. At that point in time, they were equals, or maybe even slightly going towards Russia. But now we can see which one had the better choice. Sometimes the fate of history is not in our hands. We don't always know. The ones that did go to Pennsylvania was not that long. 1683, roughly 100, less than 100 years, 90 years. About 3 generations in Pennsylvania was very peaceful, very good for them, and then things started to go a little bit awry. What was the Mennonites' view of the Revolutionary War? This is the first war that they had really gotten involved with for almost 100 years, and they had kind of a dim view of the Patriot movement. They saw these young, upstart, rebellious men as simply in this for monetary gain, and it didn't really. They didn't think it was that big of a deal. And that was a view that probably the majority of Americans, or people who lived in North America, had at that point in time. The Patriot was a very, very kind of a minority of how people thought of them. They saw it as just a movement about greed, about taxation, about greed. And they rejected the idea of fighting for freedom and life, choosing rather to take up one's cross and die. They were going to choose their faith over their life. They were also concerned that the Patriots would remove the religious freedom that they had enjoyed. Anytime they saw people who were going to come in and make things happen, it didn't turn out well for the Anabaptists. And so these Patriots were somebody that they really had questions about. The Test Act was something that did come to bite them. For the first 3 generations in Pennsylvania, they were very diligent at voting the Quakers into office. And because the Quakers and the Mennonites worked together, getting the Quaker administrators into public office, the Quakers held those seats. Well, the Quakers were also peaceful. They were pacifists, a little different than the non-resistance of the Mennonites, but they were very comfortable with together. And so the Mennonites would vote them in. And the ones who were not peaceful, the ones who wanted to use a sword, they liked this. And they started to hate the Mennonites because they kept the Quakers in place. During the 1770s, as the revolutionaries the Patriots got going, the Quakers began to lose control and the Patriots started taking power. And that turned out to be a time when the Patriots looked at the Mennonites and said, now it's our time to get back at you for keeping the Quakers in office. And so they kind of turned their wrath on the Quakers and the Mennonites at that point in time. 5 years later, the Mennonites petitioned for exemption of military service. That petition was not granted. And in fact, they came down very hard on them because they even dared to ask for it. In 77, the Test Act was passed in Pennsylvania. Almost all the colonies would have some sort of Test Act. In 77 is when Pennsylvania's Test Act was passed. And it was set up that anybody who would not swear allegiance to the Patriot cause was to have their property confiscated. And this act was used against both the Quakers and the Mennonites a number of times. It happened in October, November that year, and it had an early onset of winter weather. And so the Patriots moved in and started confiscating farms and putting the families out. The way it was working is the man was supposed to be arrested, thrown in jail, and the family was expelled out into the cold. And there were a couple of those families that died from exposure because it's 10 degrees and they have no place for shelter. And that was a time that, Ben Franklin, eventually when this started happening, he saw what happened and he went and appealed to the patrons and said, these are good people, don't do this to them. And they relented and returned their farms to them, but for some it was too late. So Ben Franklin kind of came to the aid of the Anabaptists and the Quakers at that point in time. That was a time where the Mennonites started saying, we will have nothing to do with politics. They saw that their interaction with keeping the Quakers in charge is what draw the ire of the Patriots. And so at that point in time, they stopped having any They stopped voting, stopped having any interaction with government and ruling. Civil War is the next time that they kind of had a big test. In the North, a fine was imposed. You could get out of military service, but you had to pay a fine. And I should have went back and looked at it. I think it was $400, which today doesn't sound like much, but at that point in time was huge. It was like 2 years worth of wages. But they banded together and they were able to pay the fines for everybody, and they were able to continue farming in peace. Sometimes the battles were fought on their land around Gettysburg. Some of that land was Mennonite-owned land, and so they had a lot of devastation there. But for the most part, they could live in peace. The Mennonites in Virginia, the Shenandoah Valley, which is right here, Route 81 goes right down to here. Smoky Mountains are right here. And there's a valley here, the rolling hills. It's a very rich and fertile valley, and it was where Mennonites had settled for many generations. That was different. The South did not have quite as much compassion on the Mennonites, and they killed many of them. The farms were devastated. The men, if they could catch them, they would conscript them into the army. Many of the men went into hiding or fled to the north. It was just a really difficult time for the Mennonites there. The Mennonites did care for the wounded on both sides, and they would comfort the wounded on both sides. And this kind of drew the ire of both sides because you're harboring the enemy. Sometimes the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and sometimes the friend of my enemy is my enemy. And so both sides really did not like them, especially in the Shenandoah Valley. World War I. Okay, keep going here. The Mennonites in Europe had largely abandoned the teaching of non-resistance at this point in time. They had pretty much forgotten most of their history and their largely held beliefs. And so they did not, most of them would not go to war in World War I, but they were not really that far removed from it. They were very supportive of one side or another. In the U.S., Woodrow Wilson really promoted an anti-Germanism idea during this time period, and the Mennonites still spoke German at home. Dutch German was their first language. And so they became easy targets for their friends and neighbors. The USA issued voluntary, in quotes, war bonds, and everybody was expected to buy as many as they could. Voluntary means if you don't buy them, we're going to burn down your barn. So you don't have to buy it, but we're going to burn your barn down. This was a big problem for the church. Do you buy these war bonds or do you not buy these war bonds? Many of them said, no, we're not going to support the war in any way, and they suffered for it. Church buildings were burnt. Sometimes they were painted yellow. Why yellow? Well, yellow was a sign. They called them yellow bellies. These were cowards, and so they would paint their buildings yellow at nighttime. This is where the cowards worship. The men were conscripted into the army. The young men were. And what do you do with that? I have a couple of books here. These two books here, Report for Duty and I Couldn't Fight. If you want to read some interesting stories about this time period, these are in these books here. What do you do with that? Well, pretty much universally, most of them refused military service. They refused to put on the uniform. They refused the military service. Some did take a non-combatant role, and some said, I don't have these beliefs. My church does, I don't, and they joined the army. About a dozen or so men died from beatings or exposure. It was never something that they were supposed to be sentenced to death, but you would have a road sergeant that would beat somebody or leave them out in the cold and they would die. So this thing did happen, and when it did happen, it was usually just covered up and nobody spent any time with it. This one here, I think it's this one here. Yeah, John Whitmer. His story's in here, and he's one of those that died for his position there. Many men fled to Canada or Mexico, and I have a book here too, Pennsylvania Mennonites in Mexico, and this is World War II. Many of them fled there, but that's World War II. Getting ahead of myself here. They fled to Canada and Mexico, and many of them were never able to come back home because if they did, they would have been arrested as being traitors. So they ended up setting up homes there. World War II. In Europe, for the most part, the Mennonites embraced Nazism. But so did the Lutherans, so did the Catholics. Everybody did. Germany going into this time period was very oppressed by the U.S. and allies from World War I. And so when Adolf Hitler, this guy with a mustache, stood up front and said how we're being victimized and we need to do this, this, and this, almost everybody bought into it. I actually have an article here. I'll pass them around at the end, but there's about 6 copies here. Dean Taylor, who has done a lot of study in Anabaptism, he wrote this thing a number of years ago. I think it's 2012, so roughly 13 years ago. I'll pass this around at the end. And he talks about this in there. The Mennonites in Germany, or all of Europe, had pretty much forgotten their roots, and they had become much like many of the other Christian churches. They had answered the question, what is true Christianity, very differently than their forefathers did, or their relatives in America and other places. They were considered Aryan by the Nazi Party, and so they were often given prominent positions and special privileges. Many of them were even the ones that were in the Russian bloc, when those areas were conquered, they were given special mayor of the town or whatever, because they were considered Aryan. At least one Mennonite became part of Hitler's bodyguard. Now there's some question whether he was still part of the church or not, but most likely he still was. Member of the church, part of his bodyguard. But you know what? All the other bodyguard members were also parts of other churches too. Nazism was very much based on the church. They would sing hymns at their rallies, and the churches bought into it. It's a lesson for us. A small remnant did hold to non-resistant. They fled to Sweden or other rural areas. There was a small group that formed a community at that point in time. I think there's an article in here about that as well. They're today called the Bruderhof. The Mennonites there rejected them because they held to a non-resistant viewpoint. And it was only through the Mennonites in America that got them out of that area eventually, that they made it to the U.S. And the Bruderhof communities are all over, especially Northeast, but throughout the U.S. It's not a huge movement, but it's, 10, 15,000 probably. They have a very big presence on the internet, and if you start Googling for them, you find all kinds of stuff. They do some really good class act work. This was something that was written to Adolf Hitler by the Mennonites in Europe. It is a conference of the East and West Prussian Mennonites. Assembled today, this is the telegram. Assembled today in Tokahagen, Free State of Daising. We feel deeply gratitude for the powerful revival that God has given our nation through your energy and promise joyful cooperation in the rebuilding of our fatherland through the power of the gospel. Faithful to the motto of our forefathers, no other foundation can anyone lay that which is laid in Jesus Christ. Adolf Hitler probably did not respond to every letter he got, but he responded to this one. He saw these people as his allies, and if he responded, he said, for your loyalty and your readiness to cooperate in the upbuilding of the German nation, expressing your letter to me, I express my sincere thanks. Adolf Hitler. This was a group that had answered what is true Christianity very, very differently than their forefathers. And they bought into that. They would many times replace, they would hang Adolf Hitler's picture on their church wall. But so did all the other churches. At the church that Luther nailed the 95 Thesis on, they took the cross off behind the pulpit and hung Adolf Hitler's picture up instead of the cross. The swastika instead of the cross. What happens when we get involved with this kind of thing? In the U.S., they learned a lesson very differently. And they answered the question of what is true Christianity very differently than the Anabaptists in Europe. They petitioned the government for alternative service, and it was granted to them. They had learned what happened when they did not ask for it early on in World War I. So as things were heating up for World War II, they quickly asked the government for alternative service, the military. The government agreed. A couple conditions. Number one, you have to fund it. You have to control it. These camps, you have to fund the camps. You have to administrate it, all this kind of stuff. It's your job to figure it out. The government's not going to do it for you. So they did. They started 150 CPS camps. It was kind of come off of the CC camps of the earlier years of what is it? CC camps. Any historians here? Civilian Conservation Corps. They took over a lot of these camps and moved in. The Mennonites took care of most of them. The Brethren did start some. Amish, I think, started 2. The Quakers would come to their camps. The Quakers didn't start any, if I remember right. JWs, who also were non-resistant, would join these camps. And they would spend 2 years, young men would spend 2 years in one of these camps. They did forestry, building roads in the forestry work, smoke jumpers. They would jump out of airplanes into forest fires to try to put the forest fires out. They worked in mental hospitals quite a bit. and road building was some of the main things they worked in. One of the things that was interesting is the government was trying to find cures for a lot of diseases that were plaguing the troops on the field. And so they would walk into these camps and say, we need volunteers to be infected with or be given a shot and infected with a certain disease. Malaria was a big one. And they said there was never a shortage of volunteers. And so young men by the hundreds would agree to be given malaria. Malaria is not a fun disease to have. And they said, we are here to serve God, and if it means saving somebody's life in order to do so, we will give our own. Some of them actually died from it, from the infections. But at the end of the war, by the end of the war, malaria had a cure. So they gave their lives sacrificially for their fellow man. That is agape love. They answered the question, what is true Christianity? Is I will love even if it means costing my life. 1900s. This is shifting gears a little bit. Mennonites moved into academia. They went to college in a big way in the early 1900s, and they started their own colleges. There was about 15 colleges, 17, it kind of depends what you call a college, what you call Bible school. About 15 colleges that were started. Some of them well known today as EMU, Bethel College, Heston College, Goshen College, Bluffton College. Those were all Mennonite or Brethren colleges or Brethren Christ. Brethren Christ started 3. But within a few years, all these colleges went to the left. They rejected Christianity by and large. They got involved with social agendas, and they kind of left their roots. This caused a distrust among Mennonites of higher education. Instead, they kind of turned towards a fundamentalism. Many Mennonites did during this time period. 1950s, we have a lot of wealth. After World War II, all of Europe is devastated. America is still intact, and so America becomes very wealthy in the 50s. And the Mennonites took part in that wealth accumulation. They started to leave their farms for big business and for academia again. Missions and church planting was very prominent during that time period. In fact, there was a Mennonite church started in Miami, kind of over, what's the airport over there on the west side? There's a Mennonite church that started there in the 1960s, I guess it was, 70s maybe. The idea that faith and belief were internal and had no attachments with the external became very prominent in this gathering. They borrowed that from Lutherans and some other churches. They borrowed that, and it kind of took them to an idea of where what we do makes no difference. It's only believe right. And so the fundamentalism really came in. We must believe right, but nothing else matters. They were also attracted to impacting the world. We sometimes call it social justice or social gospel today. That was before those terms were coined. But they were big into that. And they're going to make a perfect utopia here on earth for the poor, the weak, and so on. But they were not necessarily interested in introducing them to the gospel. It was just about making their lives better. And they kind of come back to bite them. And today, Mennonites are very diverse. There's no denomination anywhere in the world that's more diverse than Mennonites. What do you see there? Over here, you have one guy driving a horse and buggy. You know, there's no other denomination that really has people driving horse and buggies and not driving cars. Nobody really is over there except for maybe the Amish, but the Mennonites are there yet. But then on the other side, you have a gay flag and promoting that kind of lifestyle. Very diverse. What do Mennonites believe anymore? I don't got a clue. Don't got a clue. Because there's such diversity. You find any belief anywhere, you can find a Mennonite that will believe it. So what is Mennonite? We don't know. But what we can know is we still know what Anabaptism is, because we have original tenets. What is Anabaptist? And I had some of those at the beginning. Today, a large percentage of the Mennonite world is in Africa, or I think this is Sudan here, and this is maybe Nepal here. I forget one of the. Those are both groups that would believe very similar to we do today. These right here. I have friends that work in both those areas. Very diverse. But what is Christianity today for us? What is real Christianity? These people answer this very differently than these people, who answer it very differently than these people. Very, very differently. And you know what? I think I would say that there's probably more Anabaptist people who actually believe in Anabaptism outside the traditional Mennonite churches than there are inside the Mennonite churches. I know a lot of Anabaptists who are not in traditional Mennonite churches. Here is a book written by one. Book in Church History, William Estep. He's no longer alive, but he taught at Southwestern University, I think. Yeah, Southwestern Baptist Theology Seminary. Very good book on Anabaptism. I got to know one of his pupils a few years ago, and he was also a strong Anabaptist in the Southern Baptists. Does not really fit there, but he's there. There's many people that are Anabaptists throughout the world in other denominations, and that is fine. That is good. Anabaptism today. What is Anabaptism? You could say, what is Christianity? How do Anabaptists understand Christianity? Maybe Mennonites don't always buy into this, but Anabaptists do. First of all, it's biblical hermeneutic, a practical understanding. Christian maturity is not about what you know. It doesn't matter what degrees you have or what knowledge you have. It's how well you're living out what you do know. That is how they understand the scriptures, how we view scriptures, how we look and learn from scriptures. Are we applying it? They have a Christocentric view of the Bible and a Christocentric view of discipleship. No man can truly know Christ unless he follows him in life. It's not just about the heart, not just about believing in things. It's, are you following? The idea of suffering church, a life of martyrdom. I will take up my cross daily and follow Christ. I may lose my head doing so, or I may lose my life over 60 years of service to Christ. But I will daily take up my cross and follow him. And then the last one I have here, there's some other things you can pull in there too, but the last thing I have here is a two-kingdom concept. We are pilgrims and strangers in the world. This is not our home, and we live that way. My kingdom is not of this world, so we do not entangle ourselves in the affairs of this world more than we absolutely have to, and we live differently than our pagan neighbors. So what is Christianity? That is the question that we have to answer. And if we refuse to answer it, we will answer it. But we might not like the answer we come up with or the results of the answer. We must answer it. Every generation needs to answer that question. What is Christianity? For the last 2,000 years, many people have answered it, and many people have answered it poorly. The Nazi Mennonites in Germany said, true Christianity is living a life where we will push forward the gospel through whatever means necessary. What happened to them? You know what? There's still Mennonite churches in Paraguay especially who have a line of pictures on the wall of their forefathers who died fighting for Germany, and they still have swastikas on their walls. There's still Lutheran churches that do that too. There's still other churches that do it too. What is true Christianity? Every church has to answer that for themselves. Everybody has to answer that for themselves. And if we don't answer it well, we will lose our faith. Okay, I am running late again, so you don't have much time. But one of the things we might want to talk about is what is true Christianity. I'm going to leave this slide up here. If you have anything you want to go back and check on anything or ask questions about it,